The train is coming. I can hear it before I can see it, that low mechanical groan rolling through the earth, up through the soles of my feet into my chest. The rails begin to hum, the air shifts, and I am standing exactly where I stood 12 years ago, in the same spot, on the same track, staring down the same stretch of countryside that borders what used to be my university campus. Except this time, I'm wearing a wedding dress, white silk, ivory buttons, a veil I haven't bothered to remove. I left 43 people sitting in a church 2 miles from here. I left a man at the altar, a good man, a patient man, a man who deserved far better than me. I left before I could even say the words. Something pulled me, something magnetic. Something that's always pulled me to this exact place. The train rounds the bend. The horn sounds. I close my eyes and I whisper the same thing I whispered here once before. Fate, I'm yours. Let me tell you what happened 12 years ago. I was 19, first year. A physics student at Caldwell University, a small, self-contained campus in rural Warwickshire that most people outside the county had never heard of, and a very real kind of loneliness. You know the kind. The loneliness that exists in a crowd of 1,000 people who all seem to have found each other except you. Between the campus grounds and the market town to the west, ran an old set of railway tracks, single line, still in use, a relic that the university had simply built around rather than rerouted. Most students barely noticed them. They were just part of the landscape, like the wind turbines on the ridge or the cow fields that ran alongside the perimeter fence. I noticed them. I had always noticed them. That morning started the way most of my mornings started that semester, badly. I had a 9 o'clock lecture in the physics block. My professor, a dry, bespectacled man with a gift for making extraordinary things sound ordinary, was speaking about the multiverse, parallel realities, the theoretical existence of other versions of our world running alongside ours like lanes on a motorway, invisible, adjacent, never touching. I wrote nothing in my notebook. If there's a parallel version of me out there, I thought, staring out the lecture hall window, I hope she's doing better than this. The campus was buzzing that week, as it always did when something astronomical was happening, because Caldwell, being a university full of science students, treated celestial events the way other institutions treat sports finals. There was a planetary alignment approaching. Every 12 years, when Jupiter completes its long circuit of the Sun and rises in the House of Lovers, something happens. Astronomers call it a transit cycle. Mystics call it the thinning of the veil. The astrophysics students had scheduled a rooftop viewing event. The Occult Society had already sold out tickets to a corresponding ritual night. Somewhere between hard science and soft mysticism, the two groups were throwing competing parties at the same time, and, I suspected, secretly hoping to gatecrash each other's. I didn't care about any of it. I was 4 months into university and had never felt more invisible. Home had been difficult. I had expected university to be an escape, that cinematic golden hour version of it. The friendships, the laughter, the sense of finally arriving somewhere. But I had arrived and found more of the same quiet. My flatmates had bonded early and fast, in the way that people do when they share panic and adrenaline during Freshers' Week. By the time I found my footing, the social architecture had already been built, and I was standing outside it. I went to town at lunchtime, rather than sit alone in the canteen. It was easier that way, less visible. I took the path that crossed the railway tracks. I don't fully understand what happened next. I'm not sure I ever will. I only know that somewhere in the middle of those rails, I stopped walking. The ties were dark and damp beneath my trainers. The air smelled of iron and rain. And something in me just stopped. Not just my feet, something deeper. I stood there and thought, I could just stay here. The horn of the approaching train had already sounded twice before I heard it. I closed my eyes. Then, the impact, not the train. A body colliding with mine from the side, arms locking around me, both of us tumbling hard into the gravel embankment. My ears rang. The train screamed past, so close, I felt the rush of it in my hair, a wall of hot, displaced air. I opened my eyes and looked up. He was crouching over me, one hand braced on the ground, the other still cradling the back of my head. He was breathing hard. He was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite name, somewhere between frantic and furious. His face was unusual, not handsome in the way magazine covers demanded, but striking in the way you couldn't stop looking at a painting you didn't fully understand. Olive skin, a jaw that looked like he'd been slightly worried about something for his entire life. Dark eyes that were currently broadcasting pure disbelief. He said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I blinked. "Are you crazy?" He continued. "Do you have a death wish? Even if you did, what do you think that would do to everyone who had to watch that?" And then he caught himself. He sat back. He pressed a hand over his mouth, like he was physically stopping more words from coming out. "I'm sorry," he said quieter. "I didn't mean that. I got scared. I pushed you. I'm sorry." I stood up on shaking legs. My throat was sealed shut. I turned and started walking back towards campus. He followed me. "Please," he said. "Wait. I didn't mean it." "Go away," I said. "I'm not following you. I just live..." "Go away. I genuinely just..." "If you don't stop following me, I'm calling the police." He stopped walking. I heard him stop. Then he said, "I can't really stop walking because I live in that building." I turned around. He held up his key fob. "Caldwell Campus Residences, room 410, 4th floor, 2 floors above mine." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I turned back around and kept walking, and he kept walking beside me, and neither of us said anything else. When I got to my room, I went inside, closed the door, leaned my back against it, and finally, at last, allowed myself to fall completely apart. About an hour later, there was a knock at my door. I opened it, eyes still red, mascara committed to its own abstract art project across my face. He was standing there, holding a small bunch of yellow tulips and a box of Cadbury's roses. My Cadbury's roses, the exact ones. "I guessed," he said, or maybe hoped. "I hope these are right." were right. I stood aside and let him in. We talked for 4 hours. I told him things I had never told anyone, the family weight, the loneliness, the creeping sense that I had been promised a version of my life that kept failing to materialize. That I had arrived here expecting rescue and found only more of the same grey. That this morning had been... I didn't use the word, but I think he understood. He listened without trying to fix anything. He just listened, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, dark eyes steady on mine. His name was Jonathan. He was a first-year engineer on the 4th floor, whom I had somehow never once encountered in 4 months of living in the same building. He found this as baffling as I did. He was from London originally, Spanish mother, had grown up between 2 countries, and sometimes felt like he belonged fully to neither. He was funny in a dry, underplayed way that caught you off guard. He had opinions about everything: architecture, film, the structural inadequacy of campus Wi-Fi, and delivered them all with the same thoughtful seriousness. I liked him immediately. I tried not to show it. The weeks that followed were the first weeks of university that felt like the brochure promised. We fell into each other the way that happens sometimes, rarely, only with certain people, without announcement, without drama, just a growing gravitational pull that one day became simply undeniable. We walked between the library and the canteen. He waited for me after my lectures. I waited for his. I cooked for him in the 4th floor kitchen on Tuesday evenings, because he was, by his own admission, catastrophically incompetent with anything that required heat. He taught me how to be less afraid of taking up space, to knock on doors, to introduce myself first, to stop apologizing for my own presence. Because of him, I started actually talking to my flatmates. Properly talking, not just hallway smiles. Soon enough, they asked if I wanted to sign the lease on the spare room for 2nd year. I nearly cried in the kitchen when they asked. One evening, we walked back from town along the old railway path. It was cold, the kind of cold that makes everything very still and very clear, and the sky above the Warwickshire fields was ridiculous with stars. We stopped, without discussing it, at the exact spot where we'd first met. He looked down at the tracks. "Uncanny," he said quietly. "Yeah," I said. We stood in the dark and the silence, and he looked at me, and there was this moment where everything that had been quietly accumulating between us suddenly had nowhere left to go. He reached up and brushed the hair from my face, his fingers barely grazing my cheek. I kissed him first, a quick press of my lips to his, and then I stepped back, burning from my hairline to my collarbone. He looked at me. Then he pulled me back in, slowly this time, and kissed me properly. When we finally broke apart, he laughed, low and warm, and said, "Well, I think we've probably ruined the friendship." "Probably," I said. "Worth it," he said. We made plans. That was the thing that I keep coming back to, even now. We made plans. Summer in Spain with his family, a flat together for 3rd year, because he'd already signed his 2nd year lease, but told me, with genuine solemnity, like it was a genuine tragedy, that he wished he'd waited. We talked about the future the way people do when the future feels like something that belongs to them. And then, one Thursday afternoon, he didn't show up. He was supposed to meet me outside the physics block after my 2 o'clock lecture. He wasn't there. I texted. No reply, I called. Straight to voicemail. I told myself he'd just forgotten. Then that something had come up. Then that something was wrong. By 5 o'clock, I was walking quickly across campus towards the student accommodation block. I knocked on his door. Room 410. A stranger answered. Not a flatmate I hadn't met. A stranger, wiry, dark-eyed, dressed entirely in black with hair that fell across his forehead in aggressive curtains. He looked at me like I was the peculiar one. "Can I help you?" he said. I looked past him into the room. It was wrong. All of it was wrong. Different posters, different shelving unit, different bead spread. No trace of Jonathan's architecture drawings tacked above the desk. No Spanish phrase book on the windowsill. Nothing. "Where's Jonathan?" I said. "Jonathan," the boy repeated. "Who's Jonathan?" "The person who lives here. This is his room." He stared at me for a long moment, then called over his shoulder into the corridor. Within 2 minutes, there were 5 of them, the whole floor by the sound of it, all confirming, carefully and with increasing concern for my sanity, that no one on any floor of this building had ever known a Jonathan. Not floor 1, not floor 3, not floor 4. I walked back to my room and sat on my bed and tried to understand. Then I went to the police station. They asked for a description. They looked at their records. Then the officer across the desk turned a computer monitor to face me, and I read the words on the screen, and the room seemed to tilt. Jonathan Marcus Edwards. Died 14th March 2011. Age 19. Road traffic collision. A46, Coventry. 3 years ago. He had died 3 years ago. Before I'd ever come to this university. Before I'd ever crossed those railway tracks. The walk back to campus was the longest of my life. Darker somehow, even though it was still late afternoon, as if the light itself had decided to reconsider. I kept replaying every moment, his hands on the back of my head, the warmth of him beside me in the kitchen, the way he'd looked standing in the February dark with all those stars above us. Did I imagine it? I thought. Did I construct a person from loneliness and grief and a name I read somewhere and fill in the rest? Am I losing my mind? Or is this purgatory? And I'm dead. And I really did die that day. I was standing near the railway tracks, still walking aimlessly, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around. Jonathan. He looked exactly the same. Same coat, same slightly worried set to his jaw. He tilted his head at me. "What's wrong?" he said. "You look like you've seen a ghost." What followed was a full hour of controlled disintegration. I screamed. I shook his hand off me. I demanded to know what he was, whether he was real, whether I was real. He held both my hands and waited, very calmly, for me to stop, which is exactly what Jonathan would have done, which is what broke me most. When I finally ran out of words, I told him everything. He listened. He was quiet for a long time after. Then he said a family emergency had come up, his mum, and he'd driven home that morning without signal. He hadn't received any of my texts. He'd only just got back. "But they said you were dead," I said. "They showed me a record." He looked at me steadily. "I'm standing here. Your flatmates don't know you. I'll show you." He took me to the block, and I watched people greet him, the same students who, hours earlier, had stared at me blankly when I said his name. I watched him bump fists with the boy who had answered the door of room 410 and looked at me like I was unhinged. My confusion hardened into something I couldn't name. Then we got to my room. The door was open. A girl I'd never seen was standing in the hallway talking to someone. She looked right through me like I wasn't there. I looked past her into what had been my room. Different, completely different. Different posters, different furniture, different life living inside it. Jonathan caught my arm before I could speak. "Fresh air," he said quietly. "Come on." Outside, I borrowed his phone and called my parents. A man answered, my father's voice unmistakably, the same intonation, the same way of picking up the phone. And he told me, with cold confusion, that he didn't have a daughter, that they'd lost a baby girl when she was 9 months old, that this was a cruel and horrible thing to call and say. I handed the phone back to Jonathan. I said, "I don't exist here." The next morning, after he'd held me while I fell asleep, which is the only way I did, we walked to the physics department to find my professor. He laughed at me, not unkindly, but with the patient confidence of someone who had been laughing at this particular kind of question for 30 years. The multiverse was a theoretical framework, he explained, not a travel itinerary. What people called parallel realities was simply the mathematical possibility of other configurations of the universe, not actual other worlds you could wander into. This was physics, not metaphysics. He was, he said, very busy. A woman who had been sitting in his office said nothing during this speech, but she was watching Jonathan with an expression I couldn't quite read. When we stepped into the corridor, she followed us. She introduced herself as Dr. Vasquez, History Department, Medieval Studies, and something she described with a slight self-deprecating smile as long-term amateur cosmologist. She said she'd been watching Jonathan since we walked in because, in the 30-odd years she'd spent studying the historical accounts of what people called hauntings, apparitions, and encounters with the dead, she had developed what she called a sensitivity. Though she used the word reluctantly, like someone apologizing for an embarrassing allergy. "He shouldn't be here," she said, looking at Jonathan. "That's not the first time someone said that," Jonathan said. Her office was extraordinary. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of texts that ranged from peer-reviewed astronomical journals to illuminated medieval manuscripts. She spoke for a long time. She spoke about the historical record of Jovian transits, of 12-year cycles appearing in mystical traditions from Japan to Peru, of the idea that what we called ghosts were simply people from parallel timelines, briefly visible through whatever window the transit cracked open. Once every 12 years, she said, when Jupiter completes its long circuit of the sun and rises in the House of Lovers, the veil thins. Only those who are dead in each other's worlds can cross. The transit had been open for a month. It would close in 2 days. She had never, in all her decades of study, encountered someone who had actually crossed. She had only ever seen them, figures glimpsed in the periphery, people who shouldn't be there, gone before you could speak to them. She looked at Jonathan, and then at me, with a kind of awed, helpless wonder. "You're both doing it," she said. "You're both in each other's timelines, because in his world, you don't exist. And in yours, he doesn't. The void creates the passage." I thought about the people who had greeted Jonathan warmly, but looked straight through me. The flatmates who'd seen him and not me. The room that was mine in one world and a stranger's in another. The kitchen where I'd cooked for him. I suddenly wondered who, if anyone, had actually been able to see me standing at that hob. Like parallel lines, I said quietly, running alongside each other, never touching. She looked at me gently. Until now, she said, but only until the transit ends. She told us we had 2 days. I will not write much about those 2 days. Some things are too interior for language to reach. We went to town. We walked. We had lunch at the Italian place he liked on the high street, and we ordered too much and ate slowly and talked about everything and nothing, the way you do when you're trying to memorize someone. We fed the ducks at the pond by the market square. He bought me flowers from the stall outside the bakery, yellow tulips, the same kind he'd brought to my door on that very first evening. And when I pointed this out, he pretended not to have done it deliberately and was very obviously lying. It was the happiest I have ever been. It was the saddest I have ever been. Both things completely, simultaneously. I know now that this is a combination that very few people ever get to feel, and that it is both terrible and extraordinary. The second morning arrived whether I wanted it to or not. We dressed and walked slowly, without discussing where we were going, back to the railway tracks. We stood on the gravel embankment. The morning was quiet. Somewhere along the line, a robin was doing something optimistic. He held my face in both hands. He made me look at him. He told me to take care of myself. He told me I was not the girl who stood on those tracks, that she'd already gone, that I had to let her stay gone. He told me to stay close to my friends, the flatmates, the ones who'd started including me, the ones who would keep me solid in the world. He said he'd be there, in his version of things, thinking about me. I couldn't speak for a while. Then I said, in 12 years, promise me, come back here in 12 years, and I'll be here. He held my hands. He opened his mouth. And then he was gone. Not dramatically, not with any kind of cinematic dissolve. He was just there and then not there. The way a word leaves your mouth. I stood on the empty embankment and my phone buzzed, and I looked down and watched his messages disappear from my screen one by one, blue bubbles blinking out of existence as though the conversation had never happened at all. I sank to my knees on the gravel and wept until there was nothing left. I graduated. I found work. I built a life, a real one, with real components, the flatmates who became my closest friends, a career I was genuinely good at, an apartment with plants that I kept alive mostly. I tried to love someone else. I tried for years. He was kind and patient and genuinely good. And I am sorry, even now, for everything I couldn't give him, for every moment he reached for me and found something absent in my eyes. I never fully forgot Jonathan. The missing of him was not always loud. Some years, it was just a low frequency, barely perceptible, like tinnitus, present only in the quiet. I built a life around and alongside it. I got engaged. I planned a wedding. I told myself, and I believe I meant it, that this was what moving forward looked like. On the morning of the wedding, my cousin said something at the breakfast table about a Jupiter transit. A good omen for the marriage, she said, grinning. The stars were aligned quite literally. The room laughed. I smiled, and then I stopped smiling, and then I set down my cup. The numbers, when I counted them, were exact. 12 years. The transit was open. I stood in the church vestibule in my wedding dress with 43 people waiting on the other side of the door and understood, with the absolute clarity of someone who has been waiting a long time for a certainty they couldn't name, exactly what I was going to do. My fiancé said his vows. Everyone turned to look at me. I ran. The train is very close now. I can hear it in my teeth. The rails beneath my feet are singing. The white silk of the dress is catching the morning wind. And I am now standing in the exact same spot for the second time. Once in despair, now in hope. He may not come. The transit may not work the same way twice. The veil may have rules I don't understand, conditions I haven't met. He may have moved on, rebuilt himself, found something in his own timeline that made him forget. He may not even remember. I may be standing here for nothing but the oncoming train. But I made a promise to this spot 12 years ago, and Jonathan almost made a promise back. And I have carried the almost of it every day since. And today, Jupiter rises and the veil thins, and I am here in my wedding dress, on the tracks where our story began. The train rounds the bend, the horn sounds. I close my eyes and I whisper the same thing I whispered here once before. Fate. I'm yours.
You pull me from the iron rails, from the sound of something closing in. I didn't know my name that day. You said it like it meant something. Gravel in my shaking hands, your heart beat louder than a train. Somewhere in the February dark, the universe bent just enough for us to begin. They say time keeps moving forward, but some nights it just rewinds back to stars above Warwickshire and parallel lines. We were never meant to meet, just running side by side. Two worlds close enough to feel, but never to collide. I put life between the cracks of what we left behind, still standing where we used to be, on parallel lines. Yellow tulips on my floor, Cadbury and midnight talks. You taught me how to take up space, how to speak before I stop. But seasons don't ask who you love, they just turn and let you go. 12 years is a long, long time for a memory to grow. You told me stay close to the living, like you One of us will learn to heal, one of us wouldn't move. We were never meant to meet, just running side by side. Two worlds close enough to feel, but never to collide. I wore white for someone else, but you were on my mind, still standing where we used to be, on parallel lines. Maybe you forgot my name, maybe you found someone new, maybe in your version of the world I was the ghost of you. Maybe love's not destiny, maybe it's just timing. Maybe I've been calling fate what was only silver lining. We were never meant to last, just flickering the night. Two stars burning out of face, disappearing from each other's side. If you don't come back for me, I'll finally read the signs. Some loves only ever live on parallel lines. On parallel lines. On parallel lines. The rails begin to sing again. The morning cuts like wine. I close my eyes and let you go. On parallel